Hello, everyone. This is going to be a short, hopefully short video made in concert with your U.S. history and U.S. lit teachers. And this is a short video on the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Hollywood 10. So let's start back in 1999, a good, 40 years after the end of the Hollywood 10 and the Blacklist and all of that. And the director Elia Kazan was given a Lifetime Achievement Award for everything that he had done in his service towards motion pictures. He had been a best director before. He was well known as an innovative and important director in history. However, as Elia Kazan took the stage, many stood, many applauded, and a few decided to sit silently in protest. And they were protesting Elia Kazan's choice back in the 1950s to name names to the House Un-American Activities Committee. So here is Kazan with his Oscar, and here are some people in the audience. We see Jim Carrey on the left there applauding, but Ed Harris on the right not applauding during that time. Now, why did they do this? Well, it all goes back to the 1950s, 1940s and 1950s and Hollywood's interactions with Congress during what is called the Blacklist. So, let's start with HUAC and Hollywood. Back in the 1930s, the late 30s, the House of Representatives created the House Un-American Activities Committee. The goal of HUAC, as they called it, was to investigate alleged disloyalty and rebel activities of groups, private, public, threats to America, basically. And at first, they were investigating possible threats that were fascist and possible threats that were communist. However, after World War II, communism was the main thing that we were focused on. Now, this is during the time of what is known as the Red Scare of the late 40s and early 50s, a time period of intense tension between the United States and the USSR, and there was a fear of nuclear war and a fear that we would go to war with Russia at any moment. This is what's called the Cold War, where neither side is fighting, but there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of posturing and a lot of fear. Now, HUAC, as like I said it was called, would call up private citizens, they would call up government employees, and what they would do is they would ask them questions and ask them and accuse them of being part of a communist conspiracy to infiltrate and overthrow democracy in America. And this was taken dead serious by the people who were doing it. Now, in 1947, HUAC launched an investigation into Hollywood. They called witnesses to see, they feared that there was a secret plot in Hollywood to spread communist propaganda through film and television and indoctrinate our country through the use of the media. They called a lot of witnesses, actors, actresses, screenwriters. They called poets. They called opera singers, directors, celebrities of all sorts. Some of these people that they called were friendly witnesses. They came before HUAC voluntarily. They named names. They gave the evidence that said, yes, there was a communist conspiracy. They named the names of people that they thought might be communists. And this included several groups of anti-communists in Hollywood who actually formed a group called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. This included Ronald Reagan. It included Walt Disney. However, there were many other people who were part of this group that did not testify in front of HUAC, including people like John Wayne and others. So, here's Walt Disney in 1947. He was a cooperating, friendly witness. He said that communists had been behind the strike that had happened at his studio early on in the 40s. He also said that there was a communist threat in American film, but did not specifically name anyone. And here is Ronald Reagan. He is an actor, the head of the Screen Actors Guild and future president of the United States. He spoke about keeping communism out of his union, and he also did not name anyone specific. Now, there were those who were called up in front of HUAC against their will, and there was a group of actors, writers, and directors known as the Committee for the First Amendment that was supporting these people. The Committee for the First Amendment believed that HUAC's actions were, according to their statement, contrary to the basic principles of our democracy, and this included people like Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn, Henry Fonda, Gregory Peck, Billy Wilder, John Huston, some of the really big names. Now, some of these people were eventually called up in front of HUAC themselves. And so here are some of the members of the Committee for the First Amendment. And some of these people actually later on went to say, we supported the groups like the Hollywood 10, but later on we found out that we had been duped, that we didn't know that some of them were legit card carrying communists. Now, along with friendly witnesses like Reagan and Disney and Gary Cooper and Leela Rogers and other people like that, HUAC also called these unfriendly witnesses. These were the witnesses that were known communists. Some of them had written their names down on communist kind of sign-up sheets. There were some who were just suspected of communism as well. And they were called and they were expected to answer and give the names of fellow communists that they knew. And there were 19 initial unfriendly witnesses called in front of HUAC in 1947. Many, many more later on. But at first, there were 19 of them. And of these 19 unfriendly witnesses, there were 10 who refused to answer any questions. They would invoke the Fifth Amendment or say that I have the First Amendment right to refuse to answer your questions because I have freedom of speech. They also verbally accused HUAC of being against American values, basically the way that they were doing it. And these 10 were eventually cited for contempt of Congress, which is that when congressmen ask you a question, you are required to answer. And when you don't, you can go to prison for it. And these 10 who refused to answer became known as the Hollywood 10. Now, they were here they are right here protesting their upcoming imprisonment. Most of these guys were sentenced to 1 year of prison and a fine of $1,000. And the Hollywood 10 were John Howard Lawson, Dalton Trumbo, Albert Maltz, Alva Bessie, Samuel Ornitz, Herbert Biberman, Edward Dmytryk, Adrian Scott, Ring Lardner Jr., and Lester Cole. Most of these guys are screenwriters, by the way. Now, along with prison time, which most of them went on to serve, something that was even more painful was the fact that most Hollywood studios had agreed that anyone who had been accused of communism like this would no longer be employed. And so a bunch of studio heads got together at the Waldorf Astoria in 1947, and in a written declaration called the Waldorf Declaration, they announced that they would not employ any of the Hollywood 10. They were officially non-hireable people. They also said the Waldorf Declaration said that they would never hire again and they would fire anyone who was proven to be a communist or possibly even suspected of being a fellow traveler, somebody who was not necessarily a communist but in a group that was communist adjacent. This declaration led to what was known as the Hollywood Blacklist, where many actors and producers and directors were fired due to their suspected communist sympathies or actions. Now, the problem is that even being suspected can get you fired, even if they have no proof. Having your name named in front of HUAC, even if there's no evidence that you were a communist, could get you fired. If you belong to the wrong group, it could get you fired. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could get you fired. This was a very scary time in Hollywood and in America. Now, different people had different reactions to all this. Some people who were accused of communism by HUAC would later name names in order to get back into Hollywood. And Elia Kazan, who we saw earlier, was one of these people. He at first refused to name names, but later came back and he named 8 fellow members of what used to be called the Group Theater as fellow communists. And as we'll see, he defended his actions in statements and also creatively with his later films. We also see Edward Dmytryk, one of the actual Hollywood 10, came back in 1951 and said that he had made a mistake, he'd seen the error of his ways, and he accused other people of being communists. So Edward Dmytryk named names later on. And he went back to becoming a successful director. He even got an Oscar nomination in 1954 for the movie called The Caine Mutiny. Now, other members of the Hollywood 10 retired. They left show business. Some fled the United States for Great Britain, thinking it would be better over there. Others continued to work sort of under the radar a little bit. They used pseudonyms and false names. One guy had his wife, quote unquote, write the screenplays. One of the most famous of the Hollywood 10 was the Hollywood screenwriter Dalton Trumbo. Trumbo wrote several movies during the 1950s under an alias, or he would let one of his friends take the credit, but he would get the paycheck. So, for instance, Roman Holiday, the famous comedy with Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck, Dalton Trumbo wrote it, but the credit went to Ian McClellan Hunter. And it was not until later on, in fact, later in the 2000s, where Dalton Trumbo's name was unblacklisted and he was put in front of the credits for Roman Holiday. He was actually one of the first to be unblacklisted in the 1960s, too. He wrote the film Spartacus in 1960 and got credit for it, and that sort of ended a lot of the blacklist. Now, they were not the only ones facing this, true. There is a long list of entertainers who went before HUAC and either named names, refused to name names, or were blacklisted due to their experiences in front of HUAC. And so he is by no means the only one. And I wanted to give you a quick taste of just a few of some of the others. I am leaving off many other names with many other interesting stories. Here, by the way, is Dalton Trumbo's name put back into Roman Holiday. I believe in 2012 is when that happened. So one person was Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, famous actor, football player, opera singer, lawyer. He was famous for singing the song "Old Man River" in Showboat and playing Othello, one of the first actual African Americans to play Othello. He refused to answer questions in front of HUAC and pleaded the fifth and was blacklisted for it. Lucille Ball, the famous sitcom actress and comedian, was accused of communism because she had registered as a communist on a voting card in 1936. Later on, however, she recanted her communist beliefs, if she ever had any. She said she did it as a favor to her grandfather. And two separate investigations cleared her. And according to her husband, Ricky Ricardo, Desi Arnaz, Ricky Ricardo is his name in I Love Lucy. The only thing read about Lucy is her hair, he said, and even that is not real. The great comedic actor Zero Mostel, famous for things like Fiddler on the Roof, The Producers, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. He more or less made a comedic bit out of a lot of his testimony. He asked HUAC if it would be communist to do an imitation of a butterfly at rest, and demanded an answer of the congressman, basically through his words and actions, saying this entire thing's ridiculous. He was blacklisted, later came back to make movies like The Producers, as we see on the right there. Now, one of the interesting things that we see, and obviously you all know this because of your play that you're reading right now, The Crucible, is that the HUAC and communism and the Blacklist and the Red Scare are all ripe for allegory. Because Broadway and Hollywood are full of creative people, and so if they see something that they want to talk about, they can sort of say it without really saying it, if you know what I mean. To make it a little more clear, authors and actors and producers, people both for and against HUAC, use their plays as an allegory. So an allegory is a piece of art with a deeper symbolic meaning as well for what was happening in America. Now, the most famous of these is what you're reading, The Crucible by Arthur Miller. Miller was called in front of HUAC in 1957. He refused to name names and was cited for contempt. He was going to be given the choice between jail time and money, fine, but it was later overturned because the congressman who had got him up in front of HUAC actually promised him that he would not be asked to name names, and when he was, he basically said that's not fair. Miller had already written his play The Crucible in 1959, which uses the Salem witch trials as a way to talk about Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activity Committee's hearings, trying to talk about things like what Miller saw as baseless accusations and fear mongering, and putting people on trial without evidence and without proof, and that sort of thing. So here we see Arthur Miller with his wife Marilyn Monroe at the HUAC hearings. They would be divorced a few years later. Here is the original cast of The Crucible back in 1953. Now, let's look at a few other Cold War allegories to sort of finish up here. First of all, 1952, the movie High Noon, the Western. The story of it is it's a sheriff in a small town who defends the town against a bunch of evil cowboys who have come in, and he keeps going around asking people for help, and the rest of the town is too scared to help. And the writer, Carl Foreman, was called before HUAC actually mid production of this, and he refused to name names and was blacklisted after High Noon came out. And some critics say that High Noon was an allegory for sticking to your guns, as it were, not backing down, not doing what's right, even if no one else will, and even if it is personally dangerous to you. We also see in 1954 the movie On the Waterfront. This was a movie directed by Elia Kazan, who we saw before. Elia Kazan named names in front of HUAC, and in 1954 he directed Marlon Brando in this movie. In the movie, Brando plays a dock worker who helps the authorities to bring down a corrupt waterfront union that's basically in bed with the mob. By testifying in court, even though he loses his job afterward. Now, spoiler, happy ending, he does get his job back and he gets his girl, but he goes through a lot of hardship beforehand. And this is largely seen as an allegory for Elia Kazan's justification for why he did what he did in front of HUAC. And it is seen as a great movie. Elia Kazan won Best Director for On the Waterfront. I think it might have won Best Picture too, along with I think it won 8 Oscars in total. However, some people say it's a great movie, even if they don't agree with Kazan's actions during the HUAC hearings. The famous quote by Orson Welles, the great actor and director Orson Welles, when somebody asked him about Elia Kazan and On the Waterfront decades later, he said, "Elia Kazan is a traitor, but he's a great director." Now, there's also Inherit the Wind in 1955. It was written as a play in 55, came out as a movie in 1960. It's based on the true story of a trial in America back in the 1920s called the Scopes Trial, where a young science teacher was put on trial for teaching Darwin's theories of evolution. And the playwrights wrote the play sort of to speak out against the censorship that they saw and the blacklisting that they saw, and what they saw as the attempted thought control of the House Un-American Activities Committee. There's also, in support of HUAC and in support of blacklisting, is the Alamo of 1960s. So this was John Wayne's pet passion project for years. Wayne really wanted to make a movie out of the story of the Texans who defended the Alamo. There were only a few hundred of them defending it against thousands of Mexican soldiers, and they defended it mostly, almost completely, to the death. And to John Wayne, this is an allegory for America. America is the lone holdout defender of democracy and freedom, defending democracy and freedom, surrounded by communist enemies, but willing to fight to the death to hold on to what we have. And Wayne actually both directed and starred in this movie as Davy Crockett. Lastly, and sort of as a fun one, there were other less, well, let's say less, a little more goofy projects that talked about communism and the Red Scare and the HUAC allegory. One was Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956. This is a wonderfully goofy sci-fi movie from 1956 involving a small California town where, I'm sorry, I didn't mean alliances, I meant aliens. Aliens are replacing humans with soulless clones who look and act just like the people that they replace, but with none of the feelings and none of the emotions. They are soulless, dead-eyed people. And this movie basically has aliens being the communists and replacing people with soulless communist automatons. And that is the point of the movie that it is making.